Welcome everyone to Untangle Your Stress. I'm Danny and I will be guiding this segment on working with relieving stress, especially in our current situation and just modern day life. There's a lot going on. So this is an opportunity to explore some simple ways to navigate sometimes a challenging experience with supporting health and vitality. So I always like to start anything I teach with this quote, one of my favorites, and it's the idea of experimentation and gathering data to see really what works for you on your own life path. Everyone's an individual and juggling different circumstances and life experiences. So there's not one true or right way to do really anything. This is an opportunity to explore. So it brings us to this concept of inquiry. So I always like to say, don't believe anything I tell you. There's a lot of data and research behind what I'll talk about, but most important is that you gather data and run experiments in your own life, because this allows you to create buy-in from your own personal experience. In that process of inquiry, sometimes there'll be discomfort, sometimes there'll just unfamiliar things, especially if you're trying to cultivate new rituals. Sometimes that will be uncomfortable as you're trying new things. And particularly around stress, this is an important one. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by needing to do even more of what we're already doing. And there's small things can make a huge amount of difference. So one little degree shift can actually take you in a whole different direction and amplify your health and vitality. The final two pieces are, instead of looking at things and analyzing them as good, bad, or right, wrong, there's an opportunity here to get a sense of what is working right now. So everyone is going to navigate stress differently, and based on the situation at hand, there can be decisions that are made and data gathered on, is this really working right now? Is it supporting me? Is it life-giving to me? Or is it really not working? And do I need to pivot and change and explore a different road and some different strategies? So keep that in mind as we flow through. So let's talk just a little bit about stress. You're probably familiar with it just as being human or just in the work that you're engaging with. So we won't spend a whole lot of time here, but this are some synonyms of the word stress, and you've probably encountered some of these things before. And these things, they can have obviously physiological impacts and also mental impacts, emotional impacts, and we'll talk more about that. But this is real, and people go through this quite a bit. So sources of stress in our lives. So you can think about it just in a macro sense, just as things happening around us, or what are the events and circumstances that are on your daily life path. And then basically, what are your reactions to those sources of stress? So the guarantee is just being human, right? Living in this world that we live in, there are going to be events and circumstances that create activation and make us stressed. So where we have our control is over here on that right bubble of our reactions. So we can take those reactions and actually turn them more into responses. So types of stress in life as you walk through your day, these are just important categories to be aware of. So the first one is called acute stress. And this is stress that passes pretty quickly. So it's like missing the bus, or getting a flat tire. Hopefully it's something that's not happening over and over again. Then we have something called episodic stress, and that is, as you might imagine with the word coming from episode, right? It's something that is repeating itself on a more periodic basis. So for students, for example, it might be knowing that there's midterm exams and final exams, or knowing that you're having to pay rent once a month. That's an episodic stress if someone is struggling with financial challenges. And then we have more accumulated stress. So these are just things that are happening over and over again and really start to wear down the person, because it's just hard to get out and recover and heal, or get back up from the last stress before you have another stress. So it's something like chronic disease or chronic pain could be thought about as accumulated stress. People just navigating trauma, sexual assault, or just physical abuse, verbal abuse. So these are things that can echo and be more of an accumulated stress. It's also important to recognize that, in these types of stresses, things like people have this stuff that can happen from being racially picked out, from navigating sexual orientation, identity. So there's lots of other things that can also be episodic. So important just to recognize the social justice aspect of it, and that can be a huge contributing factor as well. So let's look at the stress cycle, and this is just a brief overview of what's happening, particularly in the conversation of just the physiology of the body. So usually there's some sort of stimuli, right? We were saying there's these events and circumstances that happen, and the body starts to activate literally, and then we have our reaction. And often this can split into two ways. One is called the hyperarousal or fight or flight. You've probably heard about that quite a bit. And then we have what's called hypoarousal. So that's the other way around. This is more of the freeze response. So if you've ever gotten under the covers and haven't wanted to get out for the day, that's more of a hypoarousal. And then the hyper is when we go into that prehistoric mode of wanting to run or fight. So the body gears up for that. So particularly in the hyper arousal state, fight or flight, we get more shallow breath, tight muscles, alert vision, and often there can be increased negative thoughts, particularly in more of that episodic or accumulated stress states where we can't get out. So it's stuff that's repeated. So we just have more of a negative outlook on things. And then as that happens, more exhaustion, lowered immunity, and then we find ourselves in a greater risk of disease, literally, or just dis-ease of whether it be mental or physical. So it's important to be aware of this, because by just having, often by having a map of how things happen, we can interrupt the process. So keep that in mind. So stress, often is talked about in a very negative way, and I'm pointing out a lot of things that are not working in the stress experience. But it is important to recognize that there is a benefit to stress in this idea of performance, and you've probably experienced this as well in your studies, or just again in being out in the world. And once again, this is just a map of awareness, so you can monitor, right? Take inventory of what is going on. Where am I? Am I at a place of healthy tension where that's actually promoting my engagement, my performance, how productive I'm being, or have I started to slide down into more of that state of exhaustion, breakdown, and burnout? So keeping that in mind. So signs of negative stress. So take a moment to think to yourself when you have experienced stress that is not working for you. So what are some things that have happened in your physical body? What are some things that have happened in your emotional state? What are some things that have happened or also not happened in your behavior? So thinking about just what are some of the symptoms that come up when we're in those really quite intense stress states. So with the body, you might have thought of some of these things that occur in the mind. Again, more of that mental chatter that happens, worrying, poor judgment. Emotional states might start to fluctuate under quite a bit of stress. And then behavior, right? So this is some things that we can start to see occurring for people when they're under quite a bit of stress. So this is, again, important just to be aware of this, both for yourself and for others, right? So there's this opportunity here to notice how other people are behaving in your life. And if people are sharing constantly that they're experiencing a lot of these signs and you're feeling them, again, this is good data to be able to say, okay, something is not working. How do I intervene here and adjust this? The final piece here, just important to recognize that we talked about it a little bit before, but stress really gets us into this reptilian brain. So this is the way that our brain developed during evolution. Is that reptilian brain was the first development. Then we get the limbic brain, then we get the neocortex. So this is the newest part. And what's phenomenal about the neocortex is that it has the prefrontal cortex in it, which houses what's called your executive functionality. And this is our ability, and this is what differentiates human beings from animals very often. It is this ability to interface with the reptilian brain and put on the brakes and say, this particular experience right now does not require for you to hit the fire alarm. So let's take a breath, let's pause, and let's reorient, let's pivot and take a different path, a different road here. So the limbic system, what's interesting is that the reptilian brain and limbic system work very strongly together. So if you think about, let's come back to the example of trauma, the limbic system houses emotions and memories. So coupled with the reptilian brain, there's this real hook that can create quite a bit of power in the brain and make it even harder to have more of a skillful response. And this is where, again, that prefrontal cortex can support us to interface and intervene more skillfully there. So, all right, we talked about lots about stress, how it lands, and again, you probably didn't need to hear it from me that this is something that you've experienced. It can be an obstacle. So how do we navigate this? The important part. And mindfulness is going to be the key to this. And mindfulness is really what we already started talking about. It's awareness. It's this ability to step back and take inventory of really what's going on. So there's small practices that help with increased attention span, amplify focus. They help us to get more resilient to stress when it arrives, and also empathy for both ourselves, kindness for selves and others. So these small little micro practices help to support that. And really, if you think about the gist of mindfulness, is this invitation to respond more and react less to life. And I love this little chart. They use it with elementary school kids. And again, it follows some of what we already talked about. Life is going to hit, something happens, we get frazzled. Number 3 is the key. Can you stop and step back? And I love that they add a little bit of positivity and step 4, see your best self. And then reach into your toolkit of lots of different strategies to be able to come out of that and then succeed and move. So we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but it is important that these practices, and what's important is that micro practices have these brain effects. So it doesn't need to be long bout. If you have time for 10-minute meditation, 30-minute yoga, movement practice, an hour, that's awesome. Please do that. But know that even 3 to 5 minutes of consistent practice, which means about 3 to 4 times a week, can help. It can support to make these brain changes that we'll talk about. So we see more activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, and you can see self-regulation is going to be important in our ability to respond versus react. More support here for learning, memory, resilience for stress, increased self-awareness, but again, it's going to be key, right, to step back. Less activity in the amygdala. This is for people that struggle with chronic anxiety or stress. The amygdala is overactive, and it's our fear center. So this is a place where we want to be able to modulate and engage with. So with mindfulness practices, less activity there. And then, as I already mentioned a little bit about the neocortex, prefrontal cortex, we see more thickness there. So our ability to call on that executive functionality for support. So they did a meta-analysis of lots of studies, and they saw that the 3 top benefits of mindfulness are increased self-awareness, attentional control, and emotional regulation. And again, in stress, you can think about this is important, right? To be able to have these 3 benefits on our side, to be able to employ these is huge when life becomes more stressful. So resilience is what these practices are going to support us to do. So you may have heard about this before, but it's basically this ability to be buoyant and bounce back when things are more challenging. So these are some of the benefits of resilience. So we want that. And these are the mindfulness practices help to build and strengthen this muscle that can support us um, to really have all of these benefits that you're seeing here, which help to mitigate stress. So really, stress is the antagonist of mindfulness and resilience, so we can engage with it in a more skillful way with these practices. All right, so how do we engage with the stress? So the first thing to explore is the physical body. So this is, I find, one of the easiest ways in for stress. And this is, you've probably experienced this in your work and studies. I like to, this word for me that comes up always is that work commitments and like the never-ending obligations can sometimes be very seductive, where we have the thought that comes in that says, oh, let me take a 5-minute break to shake out my body, or go for a little walk, or climb some stairs, or take a breath of fresh air outside. But then the other voice in the mind comes in and says, oh, no, just do a little bit more work, right? It's like it hooks us back in, and then we end up feeling super depleted at the end. Whereas if we just took a little moment to reboot, this would make a big difference. So I lead every quarter at the University of Washington, I lead a course on mindfulness techniques, and I work with students, and one of the feedback that I often get is this piece where they actually do experiments and inquiries with some of these practices. And so one of them is a movement break, and they do this, and always the feedback is the same. I took 5 minutes to reboot, and I was amazed at how much more energy I had to study, to be productive, to actually absorb what I'm learning. So keeping that in mind. So with the body, things like what's called the 6 movements of the spine, which you're seeing here. So doing some flexion extension movements, lateral movements, some twisting, that can be super supportive. And I can share further resources, some videos that I have of myself guiding this. There's things called like little taps to give a break to the body. Something called legs up the wall. If you've ever done yoga, you might have heard about that pose, but it literally is that, putting your legs up the wall, covering your eyes, relaxing music. 5 to 10 minutes later, it's quite a reboot. It works with the lymph system. It's amazing. Rolling a tennis ball on your foot for 1 minute on each foot, that can create lots of relief in the body, moving up from the feet all the way to the top of the head, actually, believe it or not. So there's all these little things we can move the body and create more ease, because if you really think about it, when the body is feeling tense and contracted, that's going to impact breath, that's going to impact so many of the systems in the body. So just by moving a little bit, we can create a slight reboot and an openness there. So keep that in mind. Again, things like obviously going for a workout, for a bike ride, for a run, all these things, doing a Zumba class, all these things are going to be unbelievably beneficial to reduce stress. The next piece we have is breath. So what's phenomenal about this is that deep breathing is great, but just even tuning into your breath. So taking a moment to pause and to just notice that you are a breathing being will shift you from these beta waves to alpha waves. And you see alpha waves are more spaced out, a little bit more relaxed. So the breath is really this beautiful interface between the mind and the body. So deep breaths are one way. And again, just tuning into the breath, pausing, and just seeing that you are breathing, noticing where you are breathing is beneficial. So your mind and emotions, I like to couple these together. You've probably noticed this. You have a busy mind. It can lead to, as we talked about a little bit, more negative thinking, distracted attention. Social media and our very heavy marketing world does not help us out in that. We have a busy life, right? Lots of commitments, repressed emotions. So emotions that we're just glossing over, not feeling fully. So these are all things that can really throw the mind into more of a tailspin. And there's ways that you can work with this: journaling, acknowledging what the mind is doing. So we'll look at some of these things. Oh, let's skip that slide. So more of these. So these are things that are going to work with the body, the mind, with the breath, but particularly journaling, talking to someone, this technique over here, name it to tame it. These are things that can support to create more spaciousness in the mind, meditation, being out in nature. So the mind is a big Pandora's box. It would require us a little bit longer time to dive into that, but those are some key techniques there. So, all of these, as you can see, these 1-degree shifts are going to, some of them work more of the body, some more of the breath, some more of the mind, but they're really intermingled. They weave together. And so keep that in mind. Just these are where the rubber meets the road, and this opportunity to engage with stress, right? And again, remember, little things that make a whole lot of difference. So that is a little crash course. We talked a little bit around stress and what it does, and then just thinking about particularly these 3 ways: engaging your body, working with the breath, and then navigating and supporting the mental and emotional piece to help you out. And just remember that piece of experimentation. So what is one little inquiry you can do for yourself? Make a little commitment for the next day, for the next week, for the next month, making it really concrete and achievable. Thanks so much for your attention, everyone, and take care.